From my window on the 35th floor, Lower Manhattan looked like a glass and steel chessboard. I was 3 pages away from completing a high-risk fraud report that had been keeping me up for a week straight when the door swung open without so much as a knock. Celeste Drayton walked in like she was stepping onto a runway, hair flawless, heels sharp enough to cut glass, the faint scent of an expensive perfume that didn't belong anywhere near a compliance office. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. "Your job's mine," she said. Almost casually, I blinked once, more at the audacity than the words. "I'm sorry." She tilted her head as though explaining something to a slow child. "Effective this morning. I've been appointed Director of Compliance." Her gaze swept over my desk, landing on the neatly stacked files. "You'll be moved to special projects." The way she said it, it sounded like exile. Helios Capital's compliance division had been my domain for 14 years. I knew every thread in the fabric, every place it could tear. Celeste's resume, on the other hand, was an empty frame decorated with the Drayton name, nothing more. As she leaned over my desk to pluck a pen from my holder, something slipped from the folder tucked under her arm. A card, plastic, shiny. I reached for it at the same time she did, but I was faster. Grantwell Advisory. The name was embossed in silver above a photo of Celeste's same smile, same perfect hair. Grantwell wasn't just a competitor. They were infamous for circling weakened companies like vultures, carving them up in strategic acquisitions. Her hand closed over mine, just long enough for me to feel the tension under her smooth exterior. She snatched the pass back, tucking it between the folder's pages without a word. "You'll be on special projects from now on," she repeated, voice coated in sugar this time, until further notice. She pivoted toward the door, heels clicking against the polished floor, leaving behind a trail of perfume and something sharper intent. I turned back to my screen, cursor blinking where I'd left off in the fraud report. Only now, the numbers in front of me seemed less urgent than the silver embossed name still burning in my mind. The report could wait. There was something bigger at play, and it had just walked out of my office carrying both my job title and a key to my enemy's front door. By the end of the week, my calendar looked like it had been through a paper shredder. Meetings I'd led for years vanished without explanation. Invitations for regulatory calls bypassed me entirely. My team, my carefully trained, quietly brilliant team, was suddenly reporting directly to Celeste. At first, the changes came with polite memos and vague words about streamlining. Then I saw one of my own reports, rewritten with Celeste's name in the author field. Whole paragraphs lifted verbatim from my work, but with the voice flattened and the analysis stripped of context. The numbers were still mine, but the credit was hers. On Tuesday afternoon, passing the glass-walled collaboration space, I caught Celeste leaning toward a junior analyst, voice pitched low but not low enough. "We'll have this place running our way soon," she said, the words curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Our way. Not Helios's way. Not the compliance way. The quarterly audit was less than 3 weeks away. Any competent compliance officer would be locking systems down, not dismantling them. And yet, she was pulling threads from the very fabric that kept us solvent with regulators. That night, I stayed late, waiting until the office emptied and the hum of conversation died down to the soft drone of the HVAC, with the blinds drawn. I logged into servers Celeste hadn't touched yet. One by one, I began pulling historical transaction data from the restricted archives. Each file was an insurance policy, encrypted and saved to an external drive I kept in my bag. I moved fast but careful, checking over my shoulder out of habit. These weren't files just anyone could access. They were the kind of records that could answer questions people didn't want asked: patterns, approvals, authorizations. By midnight, I had months' worth of untouched data and a creeping certainty that whatever Celeste was doing, it wasn't just about ego or title. I shut down my computer, slid the drive into its hidden sleeve, and walked out into the chilled Manhattan air. The city lights glittered in the glass towers above me, but in my head, the numbers I'd pulled were starting to form a different kind of pattern, one I couldn't yet see clearly, but one I knew I had to follow. 2 nights into my quiet investigation, the numbers began speaking a language I knew all too well. Not the obvious kind of fraud, no glaring anomalies, no sudden $1 million withdrawals. This was the slow bleed variety, hidden in plain sight, in subsidiary after subsidiary. I found rounding adjustments tucked into end-of-quarter reconciliations. Each on its own was barely a blip 10,000 here. 25 there, always logged with vague descriptors like operational variance or vendor correction, the kind of entries most auditors skim past. But when I stacked them together, year over year, across every branch Helios owned, the picture sharpened. The total landed just north of $500 million. $500 million, moved in increments so small it was almost elegant. I traced one of the more recent trails through a sequence of offshore accounts, expecting the usual opacity. Instead, the final hop before the money disappeared hit a domestic bank. The account name Madrigal Consulting. Madrigal had no web presence, no listed employees, no client roster, just a registered agent's name and a business address in Tribeca. I almost closed the browser until I recognized the address, 441 Duane Street. Penthouse B, Celeste Drayton's penthouse. The trust ownership had kept her name off the property records, but I'd been in this business too long to miss a connection like that. And it wasn't just one payment, there were dozens over the last 18 months, all converging on Madrigal before vanishing offshore. I leaned back, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't even reckless ambition. It was deliberate. Celeste hadn't pushed me out because she wanted the title. She'd pushed me out because I was the only one who would see what she was doing. My cursor hovered over the print icon before I stopped myself. A move that obvious would tip her off. And the last thing I needed was for her to know I was watching. I closed the file, encrypted the copy I'd pulled, and slid the drive back into its place. The evidence was solid. Now I just had to decide how to use it without letting her see me coming. The summons came just before lunch, an email from the CEO's assistant requesting my presence in the executive boardroom. No agenda, no subject line. Those meetings never meant anything good. When I walked in, Celeste was already seated beside her father, perfectly composed in a dove-gray suit, a stack of papers arranged neatly in front of her. She didn't look at me, just at him. "Marin's a talented auditor," she began, her tone warm enough to sound credible, but lately she's been combative, resistant to change, stuck in old methods that no longer serve Helios. I recognized the tactic, immediately wrapped the blade in silk before cutting. The CEO nodded gravely, flipping through a thin folder that I was certain contained nothing of substance. "I can't have division heads working against each other," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Effective immediately. You'll be placed on administrative leave while we evaluate the department's direction." It wasn't a firing, not yet, but we all knew what it meant. Celeste had the ear of the one person who mattered, and she'd used it well. I gathered my bag in silence, already mentally cataloging the files I'd secured. Celeste followed me to the door, her voice pitched low so only I could hear. "We'll manage just fine without you." The smirk that followed was pure victory in her mind. She didn't know she'd already lost. For years, I'd kept encrypted audit trails of every significant transaction I'd touched, especially the ones that smelled off. I stored them in multiple secure locations, one drive in my apartment safe, another in a bank deposit box. a third in cloud storage under an alias no one at Helios could trace to me. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my pulse had steadied. Being outside the company meant I could move without their oversight. No badge swipes to track me, no IT logs to monitor my activity. As I stepped out onto the crowded sidewalk, the winter air cut sharp against my face. I tightened my grip on the bag slung over my shoulder. Inside was a key, and Celeste had just given me every reason to use it. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I plugged the external drive into my personal laptop. The 500mm trail I'd pulled from Helios's servers sat in tidy, encrypted folders, each one labeled with the kind of vague shorthand only I would understand. I added the newest files, those tying Madrigal Consulting to Celeste's Tribeca penthouse, then updated my off-site copies. It was routine for me, almost calming, until my phone buzzed. The number was unknown, the text short. "You're not the only one tracking this money." I stared at the screen, weighing the odds it was bait. Before I could respond, another message appeared. "Meet public place, I'll explain." We chose a coffee shop near Bryant Park. I arrived early, watching every entrance. At precisely 6 o'clock, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and the rumpled suit of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks walked in. "Adrian Coy," he said quietly as we shook hands. "Senior accounting." He got straight to it. "I've been watching transfers to Madrigal for months, but I couldn't trace them offshore. I knew someone in compliance had to be seeing the same thing. Then I heard you were gone." I told him just enough to confirm we were chasing the same trail, nothing more. He glanced around before leaning closer. "If you're smart, you'll stop. Celeste isn't acting alone. There are board members who'd bury us both to keep this quiet. Then we don't give them the chance." I said. We made an agreement simple and sealed over black coffee. We'd pool evidence, cross-check each other's findings. If one of us was silenced legally, professionally, or otherwise, the other would take everything to the right people. By the time we parted, I had more than files on a hard drive. I had a second set of eyes, someone with access to numbers I couldn't touch anymore. And that meant Celeste wouldn't see every move coming. Back home, I duplicated Adrian's documents into my own archive, labeling them under a new folder joint. The first piece he'd given me pointed to transfers scheduled for the end of the month, big ones, bigger than anything she'd moved before. The headline hit the financial wires just after 8 a.m. SEC schedules routine inspection of Helios Capital. I knew there was nothing routine about it. Inspections were either triggered by a tip or by patterns that raised red flags in quarterly reports. Either way, it meant Celeste's window was closing fast. By noon, Adrian had already sent me a flurry of messages. Reports weren't reconciling. System performance had dropped so sharply that basic queries took minutes instead of seconds. The safeguards I'd built into the compliance architecture were doing exactly what they were designed to do: flag inconsistencies and grind operations to a halt until they were resolved. Celeste, lacking the map, was stuck in the maze. I pictured her in my old chair, flipping through incomplete reports, unable to trace where the numbers broke. She'd either have to reverse her tampering or bluff her way through an SEC interrogation. Neither option ended well for her. The call came just before 3. "Marin," she said, her tone sugar-dipped but brittle at the edges. "How are you busy?" I replied. She laughed lightly, the kind of sound meant to reset the tone. "We could use a little help. Just a few hours to walk the team through some of your more complex systems." "Consulting?" I asked. "Sure. Triple my old hourly rate. 4-hour minimum. Contract in writing." Silence. I could almost hear her calculating, weighing ego against necessity. "That's excessive." She tried. That's the market rate, I said, letting the words settle, and you'll have to wire payment up front. More silence, then a clipped. Fine. Send me the terms. When the call ended, I forwarded the details to Adrian. He replied with a single line, "Perfect stage for what we need." That night, I sat at my kitchen table drafting the consulting agreement, each clause tightened like a knot. By the time I was done, the terms were ironclad, and the stage was set. Celeste thought she was hiring me to patch her problems. She had no idea she just paid me to walk in the front door carrying the very thing that could dismantle her career. When I stepped back into Helios, it was like walking through a parallel version of the company I'd left. The air carried the stale scent of too many late nights, and the reception desk was deserted. On the compliance floor, the usual hum of quiet efficiency had been replaced by a frantic shuffle, papers scattered, monitors flashing error messages, voices pitched in urgent whispers. Celeste appeared at the end of the hall, her smile stretched thin. "Marin," she said, as though we were old friends. "The team's eager to meet you." She led me into a glass-walled conference room where 3 consultants sat hunched over laptops. They looked like they hadn't seen daylight or a bed in days. Coffee cups ringed the table like barricades, alongside stacks of printed code marked up with red pen. I set my bag down, keeping my tone light. "Let's see what you've been working with." What they'd been working with, as it turned out, was chaos mismatched datasets, validation routines stripped out, error handling logic bypassed in the name of efficiency. I listened, nodded in the right places, and made a show of jotting down notes. What Celeste didn't know was that 2 hours earlier, from my apartment, I'd sent the real audit trail to my contact at the SEC, every transaction, every transfer, every link tying Madrigal Consulting to her Tribeca penthouse. What I slid across the table now was something else entirely, a sanitized version. It held enough discrepancies to look useful, enough anomalies to make her believe I'd armed her with the tools to survive the inspection. But the smoking gun was absent, tucked safely into federal hands. Celeste skimmed the pages, her shoulders loosening for the first time since I'd walked in. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, a thread of relief winding through her voice. I smiled faintly, closing my notebook, glad to help, outside the glass. The consultants dove back into their work, buoyed by what they thought was a reprieve. Celeste stood at the head of the table, already imagining her crisis fading into the background. She had no idea the real crisis was already in motion, and it wasn't hers to control anymore. We were halfway through a discussion on stabilizing validation routines when the conference room door opened. 2 men and a woman in dark suits stepped inside, their badges already in view. The taller man spoke first. "We're with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have subpoenas for Helios Capital's compliance division and associated personnel." The room froze. Celeste's smile faltered, her eyes darting from me to the agents. "This isn't a good time," she tried, but the lead agent was already sliding a thick envelope onto the table. "This isn't a request," he said evenly. "We've obtained new evidence that requires immediate review." I knew exactly what that evidence was. The audit trail I'd encrypted, authenticated, and delivered hours earlier, complete with every timestamp, approval log, an account number connecting 500 million in transfers to Madrigal Consulting, and from Madrigal, straight to the penthouse she'd hoped no one would connect to her. One agent laid out a series of printed exhibits. "Ms. Drayton, can you explain why your digital signature appears on authorizations for these transfers?" Celeste blinked. Too quickly. I don't recall approving, the woman agent cut her off. "These are secure transactions requiring dual authentication. One of them is yours." The other belongs to a board member we've also subpoenaed. The consultants sat in stunned silence, their earlier exhaustion replaced by the wide-eyed stillness of people realizing they've been working for the wrong side. Celeste straightened, trying for composure. "If you'll give me a day to review, you'll remain available for further questioning," the lead agent said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I stayed silent, stacking my notes, sliding them into my bag. The agents gathered their files, and within minutes the glass walls reflected only the three of us. Me, Celeste, and the wreckage of her composure. Outside the room, whispers were already spreading down the hall. News like this didn't stay contained. By the time I reached the lobby, I knew the headlines would be out before nightfall, and the damage would extend far beyond Celeste Drayton's name. By the time I got home, the headlines had already taken over the financial news cycle. CEO's daughter implicated in 500M fraud. The coverage was relentless screenshots of SEC filings, grainy photos of Celeste leaving the Helios building, commentators speculating about systemic issues inside the company. By late afternoon, another announcement broke. The board had suspended both Celeste and her father, pending the outcome of the investigation. For the first time in decades, Helios Capital was leaderless. That night, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I answered, half expecting a reporter. Instead, I heard the measured, deliberate voice of Richard Drayton. "Marin," he began, with the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I think we can help each other. This investigation, it doesn't have to define the company. I can authorize a consulting agreement 7 figures for the first year to help us contain the situation. And, in return, you keep certain findings between us." The offer was as shameless as it was calculated. "You're suggesting I withhold evidence from the SEC, I'm suggesting," he said smoothly, "that we manage the narrative. Everyone wins." I let the silence stretch, then tapped the speakerphone button so the low hum of a second line could be heard. "Richard, I think you should know this call is being recorded." He went very still. "And," I continued, "my SEC contact is on the other end. You've just confirmed that obstruction is still the family business." A sharp exhale. Then the line went dead. I ended the recording and sent the file directly to my contact. Within minutes, I received a reply. "This will help. Stay reachable." I closed my laptop, the quiet in my apartment settling in like a new kind of freedom. They'd tried to buy my silence, the same way they'd bought loyalty for years. Now the balance of power was different, and this time, it belonged to me. The offers started arriving within a week. Recruiters, rival firms, even a few members of the Helios board who'd survived the purge. Most dangled the same carrot: Celeste's old position, a generous salary, the promise of full autonomy. I turned them all down. I'd had enough of being tied to someone else's chain of command. Instead, I rented a small office in Midtown, hung my name on the door, and filed the paperwork for Calderon Forensics, a consultancy specializing in rooting out fraud for companies burned by nepotism and insider games. Adrian joined without hesitation. He brought in his own book of contacts and an accountant's precision that complemented my investigator's instinct. Within months, we had 3 major contracts, each one a corporate mess someone else wanted swept under the rug. We didn't sweep. We dissected. Then, one gray February morning, I got a call from Grantwell Advisory, the same firm on the security badge I'd pulled from Celeste's folder months before. They wanted us to audit a merger worth billions, fast-tracked before the fiscal year closed. The name alone made me curious enough to say yes. We tore through their files, tracing capital flows, vendor histories, and contractual footnotes. On the third week, the pattern emerged: layered shell companies, inflated invoices, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. And there, in the middle of it, was a name I hadn't spoken aloud in months: Lawrence Pike, former Helios board member, now strategic advisor to the acquiring company. He'd slipped into a new suit, but the fraud was the same. When I closed the folder, the city lights reflected against the glass in my office, just as they had back at Helios, only now. The decisions were mine alone. I leaned back, a quiet satisfaction settling in. Funny thing about audit trails, I said to Adrian, they never really end. They just lead you to the next truth.